Hi everyone, Chris here. I just wanted to let you know that we're expanding this season of The Wild to include 3 different types of episodes, so you'll be getting even more great content from us every week. First, there's our new series on America's national parks, coming out every 3 weeks. We'll also be presenting episodes featuring interviews with the sharpest minds in wildlife conservation, and dipping into our archives and sharing our favourite shows from the past with new commentary from me. Enjoy. Fear. It's in all of us. It's a survival mechanism that has helped keep our ancestors alive. We wouldn't be here without it. And there is one very common noise associated with fear. Humans aren't the only creatures that produce such a shrill noise when shocked by fear. Professor Dan Blumstein says that there is just something about the physical nature of a scream that innately captures our attention.
This whole saga started when I was trapping baby marmots. I run a long-term study of marmots. I've been studying marmots for almost 40 years now. And I was holding a baby marmot and it screamed in my hands and I almost dropped it. We don't hurt these animals. I was holding it gently and it screamed, and the scream sounded like, a human scream. The sound of fear.
The scream shocked Dan. The cry of the baby marmot unlocked something in his brain, and he had a visceral reaction. 2 very different species, but both experiencing the emotion of fear.
Turns out screams are really convergent among lots of different species. They sound really similar, and they sound similar because they're produced in similar ways. Animals are overblowing their vocal production mechanism. They're overblowing their vocal cords.
Dan says that the portion of the brain that's associated with fear is the same portion that is associated with fight or flight. And a scream, the sound of fear, taps into that.
So, yeah, I think there's a secret channel that goes directly in. Not only does it capture our attention, but they also evoke an emotional response. And that's why I probably dropped this baby marmot.
Dan Blumstein teaches conservation biology at UCLA, and he's the author of the book The Nature of Fear: Survival Lessons from the Wild. He's spent his career trying to better understand the emotion by looking at marmots. He says that animals can help us better understand ourselves. And we'll explore what makes a scream and how to embrace our fears. From KUOW in Seattle and Chris Morgan Wildlife, welcome to The Wild. Let me just make sure I'm recording at this end and everything's looking good.
And if I haven't said it, thanks for having me. This will be fun.
Oh, yes. We're excited to chat to you. So you spent your career studying animal behavior. And how do you know that animals experience fear?
As an evolutionary biologist, I'm interested in the evolution of behavior. If we assume that humans didn't just appear and that we, evolved from other things, then our features, our attributes, our traits evolved from other things. And, anatomists look at bones and organs and things like that. But the mind, too, evolves, and cognition evolves. And some emotions are ancestral. Fear is one of those ancestral emotions. Fear has successfully kept our ancestors alive, not just our primate ancestors, but going back to the first organisms alive. And fear, I believe, is one of those emotions that we share with other species. It's an adaptive behavioral response.
I suppose we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the fear of our ancestors. Is that
true? We would not be here if it were not the fear for our ancestors.
Because they wouldn't be alive potentially if they didn't have if they weren't equipped with fear in order to stay alive, in order to breed, in order to result in you and I sitting here today.
We're the descendants of a long lineage of organisms that successfully got their risk assessment right. And a mechanism that allows organisms to get their risk assessment right is fear.
That's fascinating. Never have I ever looked at it like that. An essential tool for life, in other words.
Yeah, and it makes us who we are. We are appropriately fearful. It keeps us alive. It keeps us safe. It's a superpower, if you will.
You're a marmot expert, and you've been working with these creatures for decades, and they're kind of a funny creature. And for those that don't know them, can you describe a marmot?
Groundhogs, so many people may know groundhogs. We have a holiday named after marmots, actually. It's about animal behavior. It's about predicting the length of the winter. So if anyone knows groundhogs, you know what a marmot is. Groundhogs are one of the 15 species of marmots. The personality of marmots is they get up and they eat and they digest and they eat and they digest and they try not to get killed, and pretty zen out there, sitting on rocks, looking around for threats and eating. They vary in their propensity to alarm call. There are nervous Nellies out there, and there are cool hand Lucies, and we've capitalized on these behavioral differences. They vary in the degree to how close you can get to them, and there's an individual component to this, and there's a heritable component to this we're finding, but there's also a lot of environmental components to this. When they live around people, they tend to habituate. They tend to become tolerant to people, walking by them. They're pretty adaptable.
And pretty advanced socially by the sound of things. That's some pretty high intellect, I would think, for a creature you might not expect it from, with such variability in their social structures.
Yeah, so as a behavioral biologist, I'm not questioning whether animals have intellect or not, but maybe we don't have to invoke those behaviors. We can try to study those behaviors. Certainly, cognition in general is thinking about the evolution of cognitive abilities. People who study comparative cognition really see cognitive abilities, social variation, things like that, as being as useful as possible. There's many ways to survive, and you see that in the variety of marmots. Groundhogs aren't that social. Other species are very social. Yellow-bellied marmots are intermediately social. All of these work. Most species of marmots are doing okay. Not all species. Some are endangered, but most species of marmots are doing okay. Ain't nature grand? There's a variety of ways to solve problems, and by looking at the variation in these ways that animals solve problems, I think we get a rich insights into how we can insights into nature and insights into diversity, but also some of these we can mine for our own ideas and biomimic things that we see in nature.
Oh, I love that. I'll come back to that for sure. I know a major focus of your research has been to understand how they respond to their predators. What did you discover about how marmots vocalize when a predator is near?
One of the reasons I've looked at 8 of the 15 species of marmots I had a series of research questions that were trying to understand the evolution of language-like abilities. So for a person like me, an ethologist who studies the behavior of different animals, when someone says humans are unique, that's a full employment scheme for going out and asking, are humans unique? Can we find these abilities? Human language is unquestionably unique. Our cognitive abilities are unquestionably unique. So are bats in other ways, right? Bats have evolved to echolocate. So are bears. They've evolved to be fierce and eat vegetables unless they don't. All of these abilities are the product of experience and evolution, et cetera. When you say that language is unique, what do you mean by language? So years ago, a guy named Hockett said there's a whole series of features associated with language. Arbitrariness, human language. So it shouldn't matter what that sound is. There can be an arbitrary sound that can potentially have meaning. Referentiality was a big one. Referentiality means that utterances are associated with objects or events. We might label things. We can label, that's a fox, that's an eagle. So different people had gone out and looked at a variety of different species and said, oh yeah, they seem to have aerial predator alarm calls and terrestrial predator alarm calls. But the marmots I initially was studying in northern Pakistan didn't seem to have those. Rather, they seemed to communicate degree of risk in a really interesting and dynamic way. So I said, the literature says that some of these species have these abilities. Let's go out and be really precise, and let's try to study the evolution of this referential ability by giving the same experiments to a bunch of different species, and let's see what we find. And you shouldn't believe anything you read in the literature. What I found was that none of the species have referential abilities, but all of the species can communicate risk. They do so in a very interesting way, and they do so in different ways. Some species call more and faster as risk increases. Some species become more cryptic as risk increases. Other species have different alarm vocalizations, but they don't map precisely onto predator type. Rather, they map onto a degree of risk. So not what the animal is, just that it's a dangerous animal of some sort. Or it's a dangerous situation. And this isn't to say that no species have referential abilities. Chickens have referential abilities. Some birds have referential abilities. Some, but not all primates have referential abilities.
Describe a referential ability of a chicken just briefly. What do you mean? What would that?
Chickens have one set of vocalizations for aerial predators and another set for terrestrial predators. They become very cryptic when they see an aerial predator. They have a very high pitch that warns others. But if they see a terrestrial predator, they become very once they're in a safe location, they become very loud and, and start screaming at the predator. But these sounds are very different. And these are referential and functionally referential in the sense that if you play them back, you get these unique responses. That you play back an aerial predator call, the chickens crouch down. You play back a terrestrial predator call, the chickens start looking around.
Wow. Sorry to throw us off marmots there, but yeah.
But the idea that cognition is something that evolves to solve animals' problems, we were studying dictycs, which are a little ungulate in Kenya, and dictycs are eaten by 36 species of things, or we were studying them in East Africa.
Talk about stressful.
And they live in fear, and they're monogamous, right? So you see a pair of dictycs, and they just quiver when you look at them. But they have this prehensile nose, and if you play an aerial predator call, they look up. And if you play a terrestrial predator call, they start looking around and they start moving their prehensile nose, sniffing. So animals are as smart as they need to be, and those under imminent risk of dying from predators the predation selects for smart animals.
Do you think fear is the same in animals as it is in humans, the way you've described it then? Is it used for the same purposes? Is it the same kind of thing?
So there's a whole suite of neurochemical responses that you can identify in non-humans and humans. Those are shared. There are other emotional abilities and there are other cognitive abilities that we have that maybe other species may not have. I'm not going to assert that non-humans share all of the suite of emotions with us. I don't know other species that have Schadenfreude, for example. But fear is one of those things where you can see certain parts of the brain being activated that are shared in other species. You can see certain neurochemicals, adrenaline, cortisol, glucocorticoids being activated as part of a very highly adaptive fight or flight response. I believe that this is sort of evidence that we share a similar sort of response, and those responses make us feel a certain way, and those responses activate us and get us getting into safety. So, yeah, I think we share fear with other species.
I think one thing you've triggered saying those things is, you can see fear in another animal, can't you? Whether it's a wild animal or a dog or a cat in your living room, you know when they're fearful. I don't know why we know, but we know, right? We share that kind of response.
Yeah, I think that we can identify fear in some other species as well, particularly our companion animals. In nature, it's a little harder. I mean, a lot of animals should be having poker face. We've selected dogs to communicate with us, but showing your fear in certain circumstances may be tantamount to losing a fight with a conspecific, a member of the other species that you're trying to fight over some resource or something like that. So there's all sorts of ways, both in aggressive encounters and potentially any predator encounters, where a lot of animals have poker face and you don't really necessarily see their fear. But that doesn't mean they're not having it. That doesn't mean there's not a whole, as I said, a neurochemical suite of responses that is part of this adaptive fight or flight response.
Right, the poker-faced animals. I like that concept. When you discover that how a marmot vocalizes when a predator is near, how do you test that?
To study the function of a communication, you want to sort of naturally observe animals vocalizing and see what is associated with their vocalizations. Then you want to try to elicit them. So we were eliciting alarm calls for marmots by walking towards them, by rolling robo-badger, beautifully stuffed badger mounted on a sort of an all-wheel drive chassis that didn't really work well in most habitats, but worked in some, towards marmots. Marmots don't like badgers. And we also flew Eagle Knievel, a large glider painted golden eagle brown, over marmots, and that elicited alarm calls. And then we record those and look at the structure of those calls. And then we also take calls and play them back. We broadcast them back to animals, and we vary what we're broadcasting, and we look for the responses that they have. So whereas chickens might look up and squat down when they hear an aerial call and get up and look around when they hear a terrestrial call, we didn't really see differences like that in marmots. They pretty much respond the same way. They get back to their burrows. So there isn't necessarily, we didn't find any evidence of them looking up or looking around when we played calls that we elicited from flying something over. Importantly, If we got really close to a marmot, and this is true for many different species, if we were able to stalk up and then pop up very close to a marmot, we got calls that were typically elicited by raptors, by eagles. Why? Because eagles are like a strike of lightning. The risk from an eagle is extreme, and it's a high risk because they can just come down and kill you. Whereas if you see a terrestrial predator, you have time to potentially run away and get to a burrow. So the risk is lower. So this was consistent, us, a potential terrestrial predator, stalking up to a marmot and popping up next to it, and it giving a high-risk vocalization. That was sort of consistent with these animals are communicating risk, not predator type.
God, it sounds like a lot of fun. You had me at Robo, Badger, and Eagle Knievel. That's just genius.
Well, Eagle Knievel, because Evil Knievel, for younger listeners, was this guy who in the 70s and 80s would launch himself on rocket-powered motorcycles and try to go across large canyons. And inevitably, he never made it, and he broke all his bones. And then after a year in the hospital and rehab, he'd go and do it again. Eagle Knievel, our radio-controlled glider. So what do you think about when you think about mountains and steep slopes? You think about rocks. So we would fly the eagle. We'd pop the eagle off. It was a glider. We'd get it moving over the marmots. It would elicit alarm calls quietly. And then I had to land the damn thing. And landing it in these rock-filled meadows was a recipe for disaster. So I would spend most of my day gluing, taping, and repainting the glider so I could use it the next day. As you're flying something and it gets heavier and heavier, it flies faster and crashes harder and harder. So there's a half-life for Eagle Knievel.
Spend more time fixing the thing than doing the research. So what made you want to look at fear in marmots?
When I was learning animal behavior, one of my mentors was a man named Mark Beckhoff, a professor at Boulder. I went to Boulder as an undergraduate. And Mark was an expert on play behavior. And play behavior is really interesting because play is one of these behaviors that appears functionless, but it's potentially costly. So I designed a study to look at the predation risk of play behavior. And the idea is when animals are playing, are they so engaged in what they're doing, they're not paying attention to what's going on around them. So I started by using alarm calls to scare animals while they were playing and doing other sorts of behaviors to really look at the predation costs of play behavior. That got me interested in thinking about alarm communication. And then this fortuitous experience of trapping a baby marmot and having it scream. Screams aren't normal alarm calls. Screams are really different. And for the marmots I study, they only scream for about the first 10 days of their lives out of their burrow. After that, they never scream. So it's high-risk vocalization. Now, Darwin, when Darwin first came online, I'm looking around, this is before Google, and I'm looking around and searching all of Darwin's words. Did Darwin know what marmots were? And the answer was no. Darwin never wrote the word marmot. I don't think he ever went to the Alps. But he did know what fear was. And he knew what screams were. And he said screams are cries from young, vulnerable animals that try to elicit aid from their parents. And that is a function of screams. Young animals often scream. Other animals may scream as well. And there's a whole industry of coming up with hypotheses for why animals are screaming. In any event, that got me into thinking about the sound of fear and realizing that because I had an emotional response to another species' vocalizations, maybe there's something here. Maybe I should be thinking about emotions more and more, and that sort of started getting into emotions.
Is this related to what you said in your book? You talk about a fledgling crow that you found dying on the ground outside your lab when you were a grad student. What happened?
Crow. Yeah, it was a rainy day, and I was coming back from the library, and this crow came out, fledged a little early, and was on the ground, and all the crows were around it, and there was a feral cat that was circling it, and I said, I better bring this thing in. So I brought it back to our lab, and I was going to release it the next day, and my office mates and major professor were like, oh, we have a crow now. So we raised the crow, and everybody should have a crow. They're illegal, don't have pet birds, wild birds, but everyone should have a crow. Being humbled by the intelligence of another species is always a good thing.
What, with the crow, what did it teach you about fear? Was there something specific that came from that experience?
So the crow was really interesting. It was harassing our computers. It was putting its beak and caching food in our disk drives, and that wasn't a good thing. My major professor was typing and wasn't paying attention to the crow. The crow sort of leaned over and pecked the red restart button on her computer. She didn't like that. The crow never did that again. But somehow one of my office mates realized that when the janitor came in with a stick, the crow was terrified. So the janitor came in with a broom, and the crow was terrified and flew and hid behind us and flew to the highest parts of the lab and hid on bookcases and things like that. And she's like, I wonder if I could put sticks over my computer and keep the crow away. So Crow, that was his name, Crow with an exclamation point. Crow probably thought that sticks were like snakes. And we think, and that they were scary things.
Right.
No one ever beat Crow with a stick. No, I mean, he just responded to this innately, if you will. Animals have innate predispositions. We have innate predispositions. Experience modifies these things. Mm-hmm. When we think about predator recognition, people think that it's all hardwired, it's all innate, it's all performed properly the first time. Many features are innately scary, but they can be modified with experience to become more scary or less scary. Mm-hmm. They can be animals can learn to hone their innate predispositions of threatening things so that they behave more appropriately.
I want to go back to that moment when you almost dropped the baby marmot as it was screaming. A lot of your research looks at what happens physically when an alert call goes out. What is it that physically happens when a creature screams like that baby marmot did?
They're overblowing their vocal cords, their vocal folds. They're overblowing their syrinx if they're a bird. And that produces rough and noisy types of sounds that we can define as acoustic nonlinearities. And these nonlinearities are really evocative. And it turns out if you add nonlinearities to other vocalizations, they capture attention more. If you look at screams across humans and non-humans, they all have these nonlinearities in them. And it turns out that these really work to probably evoke emotions in a variety of species, but they certainly capture attention, and they seem to be the sound of fear, if you will.
Could you just describe simply what you mean by nonlinearity?
Nonlinearities are a way of describing systems. Any sort of a system can be predictable or it can be predictably unpredictable. So if you think about your car stereo, you turn up your car stereo, gets a little louder, sounds really good. At some point you turn it up you exceed some threshold and it starts becoming predictably unpredictable. It starts becoming chaotic. It starts sounding rough. The fidelity goes down. The amplitude might jump up and down. That is the point where that system has become nonlinear. And the same thing happens when you think about vibrating vocal folds in a mammalian sound production system. We blow air across our vocal folds in our throat. And if you blow too much air, like a guitar string, you pluck it a little, it makes a nice sound. You pluck it a little harder, it makes a louder, nice sound. You pluck it too hard, it starts sounding really bad. That non-linearity, that shift from sounding good to, quote, sounding bad, is the point in which that system becomes predictably unpredictable. And this is what characterizes the sound of fear, I'd say, and this is what happens when animals scream.
But does that mean that non-linearity, that sort of acoustic noise that is beyond comfort, does that translate into fear for us or anxiety? Like when you blow your speakers, when you're playing your electric guitar or you turn your car stereo up too loud, does it translate into fear, into something negative?
It certainly captures our attention. People have played a variety and worked with humans. We've done stuff, it's not published right now, but where we've looked at autonomic nervous system responses, and when you compare the response to sort of a predictable, not nonlinear sound, without noise, without these nonlinear acoustic attributes, you get a normal response. As soon as you add those, you start getting pupillary responses, and your eyes go up a little bit. And these are behavioral correlates of emotion. A colleague went the next step further and did what I want to do. He put people in a tube. He was functionally imaging their brain, and he played back the sound of people saying something or screaming it. And when they screamed it, same words, and when they screamed it, these sounds became nonlinear. He was focusing on roughness, which is another characteristic of screamed sounds. But this roughness is a nonlinearity. And he played these back, and the rough ones, the screamed vocalizations, same words, targeted the amygdala, the portion of the brain that's associated with fear, the portion of the brain that's associated with fight or flight.
This non-linear sound, you've looked at it in other places besides just in the animal world.
Yeah, so I was giving a popular talk about the nonlinearity idea, and I said, I bet this applies to sort of, movie soundtracks. And a guy comes up to me and says, hey, I'm interested in music and emotion, and I'm working on a PhD, and I'm a film score composer. And I go, I bet you're right. I go, let's do a study. He's like, okay, well, what's that? Because he was sort of coming to it from the psychological side and wasn't really doing studies per se. And so we looked at we went to various lists. We sort of said, well, what's the most, what are the top 10 most scary movies? The Shining and Jaws and things like that. Well, then we said, what about sad emotional films? What about adventure films? What about other genre? And we made a series of predictions about, well, we probably would see nonlinearities more likely in the scary movies than in, say, the sad movies. Mm-hmm. So we went out and we made spectrograms, voice prints, if you will, of key scenes in these films. So Psycho, the shower scene, right?
Oh, classic. The hair just stood up on the back of my neck just with the word psycho, yeah.
Yeah, Psycho's a good one. And we're not looking at a system here. We're looking at a very sculpted sound space, right? There are instruments. There is spoken word. There may be screams and non-spoken vocalizations. There's Foley, sound effects. There might be diegetic sound or background sound, all put together. So it took us a while to come up with a way to score these things. But when we scored them, and what we found was there were more noisy and other types of nonlinearities in the highly evocative scenes of horror films than not. And there were less than would be expected by chance in the sad films. Now, I don't know what it is with those violins, in sad films, but certainly on airplanes, I'm always crying when I'm watching a sad scene on an airplane.
Me too. I'm the other guy blubbing on the plane next to you. Yeah,
it's really embarrassing. So those are not nonlinearities. Those are their own things. Adventure films, about nothing really stood out, but what really stood out was in the horror scenes and in the scary films. And if you think about Psycho, Janet Leigh's first scream was a real scream. Now, it's either because Hitchcock turned off the hot water in the shower, or it was just a real scream. Huh. The screams after that were more dramatic screams, but that first one was chock full of nonlinearities and noise. So we then said, okay, great. I went to another colleague at UCLA and I said, Greg Bryant, you study people. He's like, yes. And I go, you study emotion? Yes. And you study music? Yes. And you importantly have access to students that we can use as experimental subjects. He goes, of course. So the dirty secret about human psychology is most of what we know comes from studies of undergraduates at universities who are coerced into taking part in experiments for points. So we got
chuck him in the shower and have someone approach him with.
We didn't do that. But we got protocols for this approved, and we basically composed music this is with Peter and Greg, and we composed little ditties. And my colleague Peter Kay had done some gig years and years ago for MTV where he made 10-second films. And he said in 10 seconds you actually can tell the story. So these films and the soundtracks associated with them were really benign things. People walking, making a right turn. People walking, making a left turn. People reading and turning the page. People sitting and having a cup of coffee, drinking at 5 seconds. Phone rings at 5 seconds. People say hello. So we then created a whole series of matched soundtracks that either didn't have nonlinearities in them or had nonlinearities in them. And we designed this as a multimodal experiment because communication works through multiple modalities. I've been talking about sound, but a soundtrack, a movie also has visual features. And there's a whole really interesting literature study of how we perceptually bind different stimuli, how we take a sound and a visual stimulus and bind them to create what might be called a unified percept. In any event, what we found was we had very benign, poorly filmed images, but we had really good professionally made sounds. And when we played the sounds alone, we actually and asked people to rate these on a scale of how positive they were and how arousing they were, which are two dimensions of emotional description. What we found was that the nonlinear sounds were perceived as more negative and more arousing. So that is self-reported, and a lot of undergraduates, that's self-reported evidence that these are emotionally salient.
Did you say that you did that separately to visual cues that might scare somebody?
We did the visual alone, we did the sound alone, and we did the visual and the sound together. And we didn't find anything when we did the visual alone. We didn't find, they're very benign tracks. We didn't find anything when we bound them together into the visual with the sound.
Wow.
Possibly because there's visual dominance, that it's a benign scene and whatever. But when we played the sounds alone to the people, they actually rated these as arousing, the nonlinear sounds as arousing and negative.
Wow, makes you just think so much about the evolution of animals and what we might have in common with animals, that the sound is perhaps the prevalent fear trigger. The other thing that I think about is it's human nature, right, to be fearful or anxious about certain sounds, and we approach them and feel them and hear them every day. The stuff that you were saying about nonlinear sound, it's almost like, is this simplifying it? The difference between listening to classical music or spa music versus death metal, right? Is that a simplification of it, or is it exactly that?
Yeah, so I live in LA and there are no marmots here and the marmots are hibernating. So I find myself trying to, seek out good musicians and asking them how they communicate emotion. And I've talked to, metal people and other people. And I think good musicians know how to arouse us, whether it's classical or whether it's death metal. I mean, 1812 Overture in its culmination is filled with noise and it's very arousing. And they've intuitively figured this out. I think I provided an insight that allows us to explain why it works the way it works. But very successful musicians, very successful film score composers, very successful editors, and people that are making films know how to intuitively hit our emotions and arouse us in various ways. And some of these ways tap into what I'll call our inner marmot. Some of these ways are based on how we biologically respond to certain sorts of sounds and vocalizations.
What's clear is that so much of it, when you think of a composer creating music and a score for a film, you just think of them using their creative side of their brain, right? But it seems like there is a science that can overlap with this and make things even more effective. Perhaps some of them already use that.
Again, what was really interesting is there's a huge music and emotion literature out there, and most of it is divorced from biology. They talk about minor scales and things like that capture our attention. But why do these things capture our attention? And what I and others have brought to this conversation is the biological basis of why we respond certain ways to at least fearful things. I don't understand why I cry on listening to, watching particular sad scenes, particularly on airplanes. I don't know what makes me sad. I don't know how to study sadness in other animals. Maybe a dog that we've evolved to communicate with us, but I don't know what a sad marmot is. I don't know how to read those emotions in the wild. Maybe a sad chimpanzee in the wild, but other things, I don't know how to study those emotions. I do know how to study fear because if you give something to an animal, a particular stimulus, you can look for that immediate response because it taps into this fight or flight response. But sadness and depression, which didn't just evolve in us, are part of a much more adaptive situation where you slow down, where you, if anything, you don't do anything, you freeze. So that's harder to study. You can't trigger it in the same way that you can trigger a fearful response. So fearful responses, fearful emotions, I think, are easier to study than other emotions. But there probably is a continuity between species on even those. And trying to understand sad when we listen to sound is a noble enterprise. I don't know how to study it in a comparative way.
I'm switching for the last couple of questions here to how we can reflect on what you've learned through marmots and other. This has gone so fast, this conversation. It's a great sign. I've loved it. How has studying marmots helped you understand fear better? Is there a way to encapsulate what these creatures that you've been studying for decades now have really taught you about fear?
What have I learned by listening to my inner marmot? One thing I've learned by studying marmots in general and studying the same population again and again and again and again is that context is really important. You know, you may respond one way adaptively in one situation, and there might be another adaptive response in another situation. And I started my career by studying play behavior, and maybe now I'm not ending it right now, but I'm getting more interested in longevity and senescence as I age and become senescent myself. But context matters, and our adaptive levels of fear vary. I hurt my back a number of years ago, and at the time I was living in Los Angeles and I had to cross 8 lanes of traffic to get to work, and I was walking to work, but I was walking really slowly and the light would change on me while I'm in traffic. Normally I would just skip across that intersection, but when I couldn't walk because of my back pain, I was walking much more slowly. Do you think that changed my decisions about when to cross? Yes, of course it did. That's an adaptive example of using fear to keep you safe and modifying your assessments of risk based on personal condition. You know, I used to do extreme skiing. I'm not doing that anymore. I think there's an ontogeny to everything. I think understanding and accepting that we do age, that we do become frail, that we don't have the strength we had before that could get us out of situations changes what we do. And fear drives some of that. So I think that I'm aging and looking as a bird might look down on myself, noting that I'm changing my behavior because of the risk assessments are varying over time.
But then how much of that is associated with your age? If you were doing this, if I was asking the 25-year-old Dan, what would your response be to what you've learned from these marmots about perhaps living differently or looking at fear differently?
Yeah, the 25-year-old Dan wasn't really into thinking about marmot fear, but was more confronting his own fears of skiing that extreme thing or climbing this steep slope or whatever. Yeah, I think that all successful mountaineers make it back at the end of the day. And that is really about managing risk and knowing what you're capable of and managing fear as well. I was reading something the other day about a Ukrainian who was saying, we're all afraid. It's just about managing that fear so that you can do your job when you're, being shot at on a mission. And I think that I co-direct an evolutionary medicine program at UCLA, and evolutionary medicine really takes the ecology and evolution and brings that forward into thinking about health and wellness. And if you think about much of the biomedical research going on, it's really focusing on physiology and genetics, which are very proximate things. But many traits can be viewed as features that evolve to keep us healthy. An example would be a fever. Fevers are good things in that they kill bacteria. It's our body's way of getting us back to a healthy state. You don't really want to treat low fevers that much. Very high fevers will kill you. Fevers are actually your body's way of healing itself. Similarly, anxiety and fear are your body's way of keeping you safe. And the problem isn't that we're anxious. The problem isn't that we have fear. The problem is we're anxious about being anxious. So a colleague of mine who's a founder of the field of evolutionary medicine, Randy Nesse, is a psychiatrist and used to have an anxiety clinic. And he would say that people would come in and they were being anxious about being anxious, and he would talk to them about how natural fear and anxiety are and how it keeps animals alive. And he would give them a biology lecture, and he said 15% of them never came back again. I think they were cured. Maybe they thought he was crazy, but no, 15% of them probably did experience that it's okay to be anxious, and being anxious about being anxious probably isn't a good use of time. And I think that we gain insights from looking at non-humans to help us understand our own predicament. Of course, post-traumatic stress disorder is horrible and paralyzes people. And that is basically a very adaptive response to being in a really bad situation. So the fact that you can learn quickly to respond to certain triggers is a very adaptive response. Reversing that can be very difficult because it is a very adaptive response.
Because it becomes very hardwired in the case of PTSD, right? It's not a fleeting thing.
Right,
Yeah.
and it's paralytic.
Yeah. This thought of how we can learn from animals in a human world that does, for some, most people, many people, have some level of fear and anxiety in it, and especially these days, for one reason or another. We live in a fearful world. We live in a place that riddles people with anxiety. What do you really feel that we could learn from the creatures you've studied about how they cope with fear to help us cope with it?
Well, the marmots I study don't have politicians, but we shouldn't believe fear-mongering politicians. There will always be risks. We cannot eliminate all risks. And fear sells. It's a cheap, effective way to get people to listen to you. And I think we're smarter than that. And I think we shouldn't let fear drive our lives. We should be aware of it. We should cherish it. We should embrace it. But we shouldn't let it paralyze us or convince us that we have to do evil things to others necessarily. Fear is something that if you don't have a better argument, you invoke fear. And I think that's just a cheap shot.
Wow, so wonderfully said. I'm so glad I asked you. Do you think that marmots are anxious about being anxious?
I don't know. Marmots have poker face. I kind of look at these marmots. There are nervous Nellies. There are females that are more likely to call than not. There are cool hand Lucies. We were looking at a whole bunch of playback experiments results that we did with marmots to bring them in and ask another question a number of years ago. And there was one female that we probably did 10 experiments to over the years, and we could never score them because she heard any stimulus we gave her, she just ran into her burrow. Which was extraordinary. So she didn't respond differently to anything. She didn't like a bird song. She didn't like anything coming out of the speakers, the hidden speakers that we had. And she was just a non-player. There are females that flee you very far away when you're walking towards them, and there are others that let you just walk right up to them. So, the animals differ. And presumably, if you view anxiety as something like a light switch that you can turn up a little and turn down a little, the more anxious ones are more likely to flee at a greater distance than the other ones. And they're not fleeing with their eyes wide open. They're just getting out of there to be safe. So I think that we probably have different levels of anxiety, but I kind of like to see it in their face. I'm not seeing it in their face. They just have fuzzy faces, cute fuzzy faces.
Yeah, oh my goodness. Yeah, they are the cutest creatures. You do all this research that is studying fear. How do you apply it to conservation and things that the planet and ecosystems and species need now?
How do we apply some of these insights from studying fear and anti-predator behavior? I think one way is when we think about human-wildlife conflicts, sometimes we want to attract animals and sometimes we want to repel animals. So that you can develop attractants or deterrence based on fearfulness or deterrence based on fearfulness. So I think that developing non-lethal deterrence is hard, but if we can tap into natural ways animals are responding to things, it may lead to more successful natural deterrence, non-lethal deterrence. I think that understanding that fear is important ecologically, understanding that the mere presence of wolves in an area will change where ungulates go, will change patterns of foraging, will change the structure of the community, of the plants, will influence what birds can nest in certain areas. Putting fear back into ecosystems, we're learning, has profound ecological consequences. And it really is, predation is part of it, but it's the anticipation of predation, the fear that also can influence the structure of what we see around us. And acknowledging that and studying that, but acknowledging that, I think is really important. As a behavioral ecologist, it's really nice to simplify the world and that you can say animals have a choice of being in one patch or in other patch. For a burrowing animal, animals have the choice of being in their burrow or out of their burrow. In their burrow, they're safe from predation. Out of their burrow, they're exposed to some risk of predation. And the reason you can never eliminate risk is if you stay in your burrow your whole life, you're going to starve to death. So you have to take risks in order to live. So then the question is, what do you do to manage those risks when you're taking them? And this sort of, I think, is a heuristic to begin thinking about why all animals have to live with some risk of predation at some point in their lives, because they'll starve to death if they eliminate all risks.
The message is leave your burrow and face your fears, hey?
Leave your burrow and embrace your fears.
Oh, there, even better. I love that. That's more motivational. Dan, this has been an incredible chat. I could talk for a week straight about this because I think it's so layered. Maybe we'll have you back at some point because there's things that we haven't had a chance to explore. You've just sort of scratched the surface for us, but thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been fun.
The wild is inspired not just by nature, but by the people who work in it, love it, and protect it. The Wild is a production of KUOW in Seattle and Chris Morgan Wildlife, with support from Wildlife Media. This show would not be possible without listener support. You can help us continue to create this special immersive storytelling by donating to KUOW. Go to kuow.org/donate/thewild. Thank you. Our producer is Matt Martin. Jim Gates is our editor. The Wild is hosted, produced and written by me, Chris Morgan. A very special thank you for their kind financial support to Jill and Scott Walker, Rose Letwin, Ellen Ferguson, Anna Kimball, John Taylor, Paul Lister, Bob Yellerlees, Barbara Stallman, and Barton Brooks. Our production team includes David Brown, April Craig, Marshall Eisen, Michaela Ginotti-Boyle, Tatiana Latre, Lucy Suchek, Cara McDermott, Amelia Peacock, Darcy Riggins-Schmidt, Brendan Sweeney, and Hans Twite. Our theme music is by Michael Parker. I'm Chris Morgan. Take care of yourselves. I hope we've inspired you and maybe given you some new things to think about as we spin around on this beautiful planet together.